The concert Popularis anni iubilus by Cappella Mariana and InAlto brings us music that could have been heard during the celebration of the New Year at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II in Prague around 1600. Prague had become imperial residence in the 14th century, but later the imperial residence was temporarily relocated to Vienna. It was precisely Rudolf II who brought it back to Prague in 1583, after his election as Holy Roman Emperor in 1576. Thus, at the end of the 16th century, Prague was the political capital of the empire, and through the system of patronage guaranteed by the prizes of the court, also its cultural capital. It attracted artists of great fame, such as, for instance, Giuseppe Arcimboldo, and also scientists, such as Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, who could live and work under the protection of the emperor. One of Kepler's major works, for instance, was entitled Tabulae Rudolphinae, in honor of the Emperor Rudolf II. Rudolf influenced the cultural life of the city to the extent that historians nowadays speak of Rudolf in Prague to point at Prague at the turn of the 16th century, when it was one of the leading centers of the arts and sciences on the European continent. Now, the output of the scientists like Brahe and Kepler is well known nowadays. Similarly, artworks from the Emperor's Kunstkammer can be admired in many contemporary museums, from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London to the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And what about the music composed and performed in Imperial Prague? Well, this is really mentioned in various introductions on Rudolf in Prague one can read in print and online. And yet, music played an important role at the court of Rudolf II, just like in any other European court. Rudolf had his own chapel that provided music for the liturgy and other festivities. Composers of primary importance were active there, such as, for instance, the Flemish Philippe de Monte. Furthermore, the emperor and the other members of its family supported directly musicians by sponsoring the publication of music prints. Against this background, why is the musical culture of Rudolf in Prague lesser known than, for instance, that of Rome? This is not, I argue, an issue of quality. This state of things has more to do with the political situation of 20th century Europe, when, in the second half of the 20th century, musicians and musicologists revived the interest in medieval and early modern music, initiating the so-called early music revival. Europe was split along the Iron Curtain. Musicians on either side of the curtain had little chance to cooperate and access the music sources kept in libraries and archives on the other side, so to speak. Thus, sources in Western Europe provided the main material on which the comprehensive historiographical narrative is built, while those on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain were mostly ignored. Fortunately, this situation has now changed. But music history textbooks and concert programs are still often biased towards a Western-centric idea of European music history. The consequence is that the musical culture of very important Central European centers, such as, for instance, Rudolf in Prague, is less known than it deserves. Thus, the concert by Cappella Mariana and InAlto, by putting the music heard in Rudolf in Prague under the spotlight, does not fulfill solely an aesthetic objective by bringing to life forgotten music of great beauty, but it can be seen also as a historiographical act, a step towards a more balanced view of European music history. The program of the concert Popularis anni iubilo is centered around the figure of Carolus Luython, a native of Antwerp who, just like many other musicians born and trained in the Low Countries, left his homeland to find employment in important chapels around Europe. In 1566, when he must have been circa 8 years old, he was appointed as a choir boy in the chapel of Maximilian II, the father of Emperor Rudolf. When his voice changed, Luython spent some time in Italy. At the time, Italy was regarded as the hotbed of musical innovation, and it was thus common that young musicians were sent there in order to improve their musical skills. In 1576, Luython returned north to take a position as organist in the Imperial Chapel, and then relocated to Prague together with the court. For many years, he remained a faithful servant of the emperor, to whom he even dedicated a book of polyphonic masses in 1609. This work relation, however, did not end very well for Luython. After Rudolf's death in 1612, his brother and successor, Emperor Matthias, disbanded the court chapel and refused to pay the debts to its members. Luython died in poverty in 1620 without ever managing to collect the money that the imperial court owed him after decades of service. But let us now leave these unfortunate circumstances to recollect instead a joyful event that took place circa 30 years earlier. In 1587, Luython published in Prague, at the workshop of the printer Georg Nigrin, a most peculiar collection of motets entitled Popularis anni iubilo, which inspired the title of the concert you're about to hear and provided inspiration for its program. Popularis anni iubilo literally means the rejoicing of the people's year, and it contains motets that mark different celebrations throughout the year, starting from New Year's Day and running up to Christmas. The relation to the new year is apparent also in the dedication letter that opens the collection, which was signed by Luython in Prague precisely on the 2nd of January 1587. As the title makes clear, the motets in the collection were intended as an expression of joy and praise. The iubilus, which I translated as rejoicing, is a scriptural concept, which is explained, for instance, by St. Augustine as the voice of a soul poured out in joy. The wheel of time, the passing of the year, is thematized not only in the title of the collection, but also in its very first motets, Annus Exactix Defluxit, a composition that you will hear during the concert. This motet was intended to celebrate the end of the old year and the beginning of the new one. It states, for instance, that the annual circle has run down, the months are completed. And at the same time, it looks forward to a future when, and I'm quoting, consuming sickness will flee and healthy bodies will rejoice. This reference to a happy future does not only express a wish for the coming year, but it also has religious implications, pointing at the coming of the Savior that is celebrated in the last motet of the collection dedicated to Christmas. In a way, Luython's collection represents also in its own structure the wheel of time. What is astonishing of the collection Popularis anni iubilo is the reference to the popularis, to the people. The texts of the motets, which were written by the canon of Prague Cathedral Georgius Bartholdus Pontanus, bring together not only references to the liturgical year, but also to popular religion. The texts are full of traces of folklorized rituals that existed alongside the official rituals of the Church. Thus, Luython's collection offers a unique window onto the compresence of official religion and folklore that characterized celebrations even in a city like Imperial Prague. To mention one example of this, let's consider the motet Officis Soci, which you will hear during the concert. Its text refers to the three kings of Epiphany, the wise men who followed the Star of Bethlehem to visit the infant Jesus. And yet, the same text mentions also a fourth king, who is hailed with the words Rex noster vivat, bibat et rebibat. In English, may our king live, may he drink and drink again. Obviously, this drinking king is not a product of official religion. Quite the contrary, this motet probably refers to the popular tradition of the bean king, a tradition that was well spread in entire Europe. The person who would find a bean in its Epiphany cake would become king for a day and lead the joyful celebrations. The program of the concert features music by other composers directly connected to the Imperial Chapel in Prague, such as, for instance, Nicolaus Zangius and Giovanni Battista Pinello de Gherardi. Zangius, a German, and Pinello de Gherardi, an Italian, both worked for some time at the imperial court in Prague during the reign of Rudolf II, and this gives us a sense of the cosmopolitan nature of the imperial chapel, where different musical traditions could meet. Other compositions, part of the program instead, made their way to Prague thanks to music printing, which in the years around 1600 enabled a pan-European circulation of music that would have been unimaginable 100 years before in the age of manuscript transmission. We know, for example, that copies of the Strasbourg anthology Promptuarium Musicum made their way to Prague, thus enabling the Central European reception of compositions by Italian composers who had never left the Italian peninsula, such as, for instance, Giovanni Battista Stefanini, who composed the 7-part Beata es Virgo Maria that will be performed during the concert. Speaking of music printing, it is worth mentioning one last prominent feature of the program, put together by Cappella Mariana and InAlto. Luython's collection Popularis anni iubilo, which, as I've said, represents the gem of the concert, was printed in part books. Part books are the usual format to publish music in the time. They consist in a series of separate booklets, each containing the music for one single part. That is, one book for the soprano, one book for the alto, one book for the tenor, and so on. This layout had several advantages, but also caused that, in the course of centuries, some of the part books were destroyed or lost, thus causing the music to survive in incomplete form. This is unfortunately the case of the Popularis anni iubilo by Luython, for which we have only 5 of the original 6 part books. For this reason, music from this fascinating collection was never performed in modern times, and it is thus a great opportunity for us to hear it during Laus Polyphoniae. We will hear it in a restored form, so to speak, with the missing voice recomposed by the early music specialist Marc Bunel according to the stylistic conventions of the time, so that this music can be appreciated in its full splendor.